Welcome back, more in common. Ready to talk to you about censorship as it
Rod and
relates
Keith
to
riffing. Let's go.
political correctness. I'm Keith.
PC, political correctness. I'm Rodney.
Yeah. So
This is
you sent
go.
me a text the other day,
Yeah.
and you said I realized why political correctness um
Why it bothers me?
bothers me, because censorship hardly ever works. I want you to expand on that because I had some initial reactions. I had a conversation with you privately that was probably like, I don't know. I don't know why I got so reacted to it. So I'm curious to understand like what you mean.
Yeah. I don't even remember talking to you about this. So if we did, I was definitely
We
not.
have not talked about it. No, I
Okay.
talked to myself about it. Like you and I had
Oh.
a conversation that
Yeah.
you weren't a part of.
Yeah, I mean, because
Yeah.
so part of what I see and what I hear in political correctness circles, or like when stuff comes up, is, oh, you should never say this or you shouldn't say that, or what was he thinking or what was she thinking? And what I realized the other day is what I'm hearing is that, like, oh, we're gonna censor a word, like, or a thought. And I'm like, man, I don't know a time that censorship has worked in history. Like, look at prohibition, look at, like, I just don't know a time where people have been told they can't do a thing and they're like, yep, all right, like,
But
we'll
that
stop.
but that also comes down to the delineation, right? Like of state censorship is a problem, right? Like the government saying you can't say this is one thing versus it being socially unacceptable where a group of people say don't say that.
Yeah, I mean, there's self censorship. There's like a lot of different types of censorship for sure. I'm and I think some people push it in a way that makes it not that much different than state censorship, in my opinion. Like, it
Mm.
is this heavy-handed, don't do this, you can't do this, and it I just don't see it. I don't see it helping. Like, it's not a conversation. It's not a learning opportunity. It's not like what are we really doing? It's and the reason censorship doesn't work. The reason is it goes back to this, like, the concept of knowing the type of situation you're in, the type of game that you're playing. For instance, like, language, words change over time, and it's frustrating sometimes. It's like, wait, no, man, like, that's not a real word. It's like, actually, now it is a real word. Because the way language works, like, it would be qualified as an infinite game, something that has no end, something that has actually no goalposts. It's something that changes with generations and with decades and all these things. And so if you stay fixed, then as it changes, like, you're gonna probably have a challenge understanding it as it moves. And just to be like, I'll use the N word. Like, it is it has its meaning throughout time, and then it has been taken by black folk and changed and altered to be by some black folk to be used as a just social, like, hey, I just use it all the time. And some people use it selectively, and some people are like, nah, I never want to use it. And I just I think it has to be at a self level. And I think with that, that means when you use a word or a phrase that I don't identify with or don't like or feel oppressed by, like, I got a choice. Can I be like, Keith, I don't like that, and here's why? Or I can be quiet. But, like, to say you can't say that, like, because that, I guess that's a third response. Like, nope, you can't say that.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It reminds me of Shy in the word like Shy's episode on our podcast.
I rambled a lot right
Shy's.
there, by the way.
Yeah, it was good though. Shy's talking about how she doesn't like the word bitch.
Oh,
So
yeah.
don't call her that. Not don't say it. Like you say what you got to say, but don't direct that word towards me.
To her, yeah.
It's this weird evolution, the social evolution in our global construct, quite honestly. Like, and I don't think it gets talked about enough in the context of interaction, of social expectations. It gets talked about, but population growth, like in 1900 and for the prior 2000 years, I mean, God, the world population wasn't more than 900 million. Maybe it got to a billion. 120 years later, we are at 7.6 billion people on this planet. in 1950, there were 2.5 billion people on the planet. Meaning, as a ratio in the United States, there were a lot less. There were a lot more white people as a ratio to minorities than there are today, right? Like, and we've prided ourselves specifically in the United States on this melting pot culture. And two things have happened, in my opinion, that make this impossible to do. Is the two things have happened. One, there has been an influx of social melding, right? Like the adoption in white circles of hip hop culture, and the adoption of whatever. I just name it, right? Like that's the one that comes to my mind right now.
That's a big one.
And
Cultural
there's
appropriation.
yeah,
In
sure.
general, right?
But in general, right, there's a cultural appropriation. Everybody's kind of picking up these little things, but then
And I
everybody's
say
got their own
that
pocket.
like positive and negative. I think there
Right.
are
Totally. Yeah.
yeah.
And everybody's got their own pockets of microcultures and subcultures and different mores and norms that
Folk
are
ways.
now starting to boil up, right? Like it used to be that the white male dominated culture was what was expected of everybody, and all these subjugated cultures were underground, right? Like I need to go be secret, or things are going to be really, really bad in my life. And it was this pressure campaign. Now that pressure still exists, but now with social media, and as the Facebook groups commercials like to promote, there's a group for everybody, like kazoo players. Like this growth of awareness to all of these ecosystems makes it really, really hard to have a common culture of expectations. And that applies to words, right? I think in the United States, we should culturally accept the fact that the N word has such roots and negativity in our current place. But at the same time, there are subcultures that use it, like in hip hop. You'll use it in certain circumstances. I'll never use it, right? And it's got to be used, but the way it's
But
used
it's like,
often
yeah,
matters,
you're gonna
right?
tell
Like,
me or some group that they can't reclaim it and
yeah,
repurpose it
right.
to mean
But
something positive for them.
generally speaking, like aside from some hate language, right, that really has vitriolic usage to subjugate and demean other people,
Yeah.
like I mean, political correctness is hard because it overcomplicates the need to limit hate language that truly can impact a group and individual,
Mm.
like the N word, like the F word for gay people, which I don't like saying, or the R word for mental retardation, and like those. But even using the word retarded in its proper context, it should, just because like you might not know its proper context, like the oil was retarded from
From
the engine,
flowing,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Like I'm not calling the engine, like there's a
There is
proper
an
use
actual
for that, right?
use
Yeah.
for
And so that's where
well,
overcorrection
and
starts to come into play, right?
I think one of our guests who we've been having released a podcast from noted this really well. He's a native Spanish speaker, and he's like, "Yeah, this is where English is limited because when you have a word that means three things or four things or
Right.
15 things, you may not know. Maybe my context is ambiguous, or maybe you're not listening to the context. You're just hearing the word. It's like when I've Reese in the last like week, somebody was like, "Oh, you can't say crazy." I'm like, "What? What? What do you mean I can't
Yeah.
say
I mean,
like?"
we've talked about that on the podcast, right?
Yeah,
Like the idea of saying crazy. But at the same time, like there are
I think there are
contextual uses for
contexts.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, for sure. And I think you're nailing it. Like it is a complex thing. And what so political correctness? Like what is? I think that's maybe the heart of the problem for me. Is like what is the goal? Is the goal to just identify like hate language and the out of bounds stuff? Because for me, and I can only speak for me. Like that stuff is obvious. Like I
Right.
know what those
Totally.
words are. I
Yeah.
know when we've encroached into like, did you
Yeah.
just call me N
Right. Yeah. Did you just
ER?
you
And did
you
you just
you
end
you
that with a
called
hard
me that?
ER?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
And that
like
was aggressive.
we've stepped into a
Yeah. There's a difference.
versus now it's you just mentioned like how it's encroaching into like regular speech in which a word, maybe a word from over there is being used, but like what's the context? So now we're getting into like the spirit or the like what the meaning, the
Yeah.
intent.
And you think about like political correctness. It's politicians not wanting to use words that offend anybody because a politician is generally supposed to represent everybody, right? Generally. So political correctness then all of a sudden trickles down to the expectation of citizens when politicians are the ones that really should be aware. But even then, like to your point, and this is where I think I'm starting to I'm not coming like I get its point for those vitriolic statements, but I'm starting to head in your direction on this because our language is limited, but our education in this country isn't the strongest in the world,
It's
right?
not,
Like
especially
and
around our language,
you know,
our
and
primary,
and
unofficial.
language word usage, right? Is the if you're in a group that just doesn't have access to education
Mhm.
or never learned it or quite honestly like I didn't memorize the context of why I would ever say a verisimilitude, right?
Oh, I
Or
know that one
using
very
the
well.
word venerable, right? Like using these words, and on the flip side we tend to demonize like, oh, don't be pretentious. Oh, you use big words all the time, right? Like,
Verisimilitude.
oh, you're using big words. No, it's like I'm accessing the language so I can best describe these things. But we have to give a little bit more grace, I think, with the
Well,
language
it's
that people use because they just might not have access to the words that you would hope they would use.
for some of my friends from the UK, like it's a running joke. Like Americans do not care about the specificity of language, and it's just a cultural thing. Like I don't know if I don't know why, but
I
I
mean,
just know
listen,
that
literal and figurative are now interchangeable in the English language.
that's a whole new topic.
like, like
And I want to be like, yeah, but I mean, I'll use literal figuratively. I'll
but
say
you talk
literally
about the
figuratively.
specificity of language, like we are, we don't have access to enough understanding of our language that we would properly use the
But
word literal,
that's what I'm
so
saying.
it doesn't
What I'm
become
saying is
it changes definition in
the
context.
reason that is because as Americans in general
Yeah,
don't care about the specific. Because of
right,
that, we don't teach it.
right,
Whereas Brits, they value the weight of each word,
right,
maybe too much in some instances. But like
right.
because of that, when I'm talking to my British friends, like the vocabulary and the like the precision with which they
Yeah,
craft a sentence,
yeah.
like it boggles my mind.
And you consider, I mean, there was this there are two examples that come to my mind. What is it? Alaskan natives who have what 300 words for snow or
I
six
knew
words
that
for
there were a lot
snow.
of words for it,
Yeah, a
but
lot of words for
it's
snow,
kind of like
right? I
love
mean,
has like 5 or 6 ways to say in
right.
Greek,
Because
ancient
there's
Greek.
a specificity to its use and its purpose in the language. We look at it and go, what? It's just snow, which is generally how we as a culture perceive language. And then there's another Invisibilia episode from NPR, if you ever are interested. They tell you this guy goes and visits this tribe, and it's considered a barbaric tribe where they
Is it
chop
the
off the head of like when someone dies, the loved one gets
it
because
was
that's
yeah.
their only way of expressing. They have a word for it. We have
But they
no
have this
word.
like but they have that sound for grief like that
Right.
was
It's
like
and they have a word for the feeling and the emotion behind the grief of losing a loved one that we have
that you can't
nothing.
understand. Like we could hear the word, but we couldn't understand it unless we
Right.
embedded ourselves like that guy
Right.
did.
Like
And
that guy did.
yeah. So I
It's
think
this
we're getting to
fascinating
something
thing.
deeper here. I know we're
Yeah.
like we're gonna cut this soon, but like we're getting to something deeper where it's maybe it's that like our general laissez-faire when it comes to our language it leaves a gap and it leaves a yearning. Like I want to be specific about my language, or I want to know what you're saying. I want to know if it's hateful or not, and especially for groups that that are just traditionally abused and taken advantage of in this country. It's like
Yeah.
like language is a tool, and it can be a weapon, and it often is weaponized against a group. And it's like, no, I need you to be specific, and maybe that's a part of where I'm sure that that's a big part of where the push
And knowing and understand, yeah, and like better. I think there's also a space here where a receiver can better try to empathize the context in which something is said, and maybe not project the standard of a politician to every, to just citizens, right? Because okay, maybe you can have a higher standard for me using language because I tend to use a broader dictionary than some, right? But others use a much broader dictionary than I do. And some have a more limited dictionary, and it's not an indictment on them. It's the access in their culture and their ecosystem and circumstance.
We just
And
solved it. We
you
just
know,
solved it. What we need is better English programs.
yeah, yeah.
A
I don't need to
focus,
know what a
a
past
focus
participle
on
is.
English,
Yeah.
focus on English language and the use of and vocabulary, and then
Conversational language usage
conversational language,
versus
like and
past participles and prepositions
and precision. Yeah, like
yeah.
come on, participle. Like I don't need that.
And just make sure you use the what is it, the Roman comma, or the
Oxford.
the
I
Oxford
will always be a fan of the
comma.
Oxford comma. I'm softening, but it just it changes the sentence. The sentence is different. Use the damn comma.
That's the message from this riffing, is use the damn comma.
I'm gonna put in the post for this. I'm gonna put an example of what a sentence looks like with and without the Oxford comma. Now I've forgotten about what we just talked about. Now I'm just on the Oxford comma rant.
That's so good. All right. Well, that was fun.
Yeah, that was good.
That was good. I
You get
really,
out there and you just have a good day,
yeah.
politically correct or not, however you decide to
However
do
you
it.
do, but
But
just be nice to people and have compassion for people.
kindness goes a long way.
It really does.
Later.